Wake up, Chad, your acceptance letter just came back, and congratulations, you've been accepted into one of the most prestigious institutions in Asia. What's that? You didn't actually sign up for it? Well, that's the neat part. Here at our academy, we pick you. And trust me when I say that there is no school like this one. We pride ourselves on our very, very hands-on teaching methods and our state-of-the-art accelerated re-education programs that push our students beyond their mental limits. Usually in a dimly lit room tied to a chair. Don't worry about it. Math and literature? What, are you gay? Because if you are, we will have to take disciplinary action. Our course subjects here include Interrogation 101, Advanced Waterboarding, and the ever-popular creative confessional writing about crimes that I did not commit. And don't worry, you'll be attending all of these classes. After-school activities include the Solitary Confinement Club, overseen by the Daily Beatings Committee. Remember to do your best, because we proudly hold a graduation rate of exactly 0%. So, pack your things. Or don't, because you won't be needing them anyway. Because once you enter, there is only one lesson to be learned. That you're not leaving. The Tuol Sleng Genocide. Prison S21. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. Today's sponsor is me, because I do not shout my own stuff out enough. But you can go and subscribe to the Patreon where you can get your name mentioned in videos, or you can even get told about what videos are coming out that month. That also counts for people that go on the Subscribe Star as well. I'm also now on Instagram, I'm also now on TikTok. I've got a second channel where I cover mostly political and news related stories, mostly around freedom of speech or people that I really don't like, but you can go and subscribe to all of those things. I'm not going to promote my Twitter because my behaviour on there is absolutely terrible, but still, go and subscribe to all of those things. Go to the Patreon and the Subscribe Star because it helps us all continue doing everything that we're doing here, and I really appreciate everyone for helping out with that. But yeah, go and subscribe to all of my other stuff and I will give you a great big fat kiss on the mouth. Before we get into it, a history lesson. Once upon a time, Cambodia was the place to be in. Back in the 9th century, the Khmer Empire was the Giga Chad of Southeast Asia, ruling over what is now Thailand, Vietnam, and Laos. Responsible for the building of Angkor Wat, the world's largest religious monument, the medieval age equivalent of a fuck you to your neighbours. And also having an advanced civilization while most of Europe was still figuring out how to take a bath without dying from it. But as all good things come to an end, so did the Khmer Empire. Mainly due to bad leadership, wars, and things like decades-long droughts followed by catastrophic monsoons, which flooded the land and destroyed infrastructure, leaving the land a useless mess. While the empire was busy fucking drowning, the Ayutthaya kingdom, which is now Thailand, were doing pretty well for themselves. And by the 14th century, they've now risen to be the big boys and they've set their sights on Khmer territory. The Khmer kings, still wet behind the ears, were losing battle after battle to the overwhelming Thai armies of ladyboys full of cheap alcohol. The final nail in the coffin was when Ayutthaya in 1431 invaded Angkor Wat, looting the place dry and forcing the Khmers to abandon their capital and move south to what is now Phnom Penh. Over time, they kept losing more and more land until Cambodia became just another small kingdom trying to survive. Fast forward a few centuries, and in the 19th century, when Cambodia was a weak, divided mess and being bullied by both Vietnam and Thailand, naturally, the French showed up. And the French said, "Bonjour, shit stains, this is ours now." Imagine being colonised by the fucking French. So, in 1863, King Norodom signed a treaty with France, promising protection from its neighbours and in return handing over control of the economy and military, becoming another French colony. In 1884, they wanted to turn a bit of a profit from the colony and they tried to force King Norodom to hand over total control of the country. They instead revolted, and France responded like any colonial empire would, by violently crushing the rebellion. France didn't really care about Cambodia as much as they did for Vietnam, which was richer and much more strategically important. So they basically did the bare minimum to make the colony profitable, but not enough to actually help the population. This included taxes and forced labour on rubber plantations, keeping the king around as a puppet, and modernising just enough with schools and railways, but not enough to lift the average Cambodian out of poverty, because we need those wages in the fields. And also preserving Angkor Wat, because tourism is still profit. As World War II came along, so did the Japanese, taking over the French Indochina, which included Cambodia. But they decided to keep the French colonial government in charge. In March of 1945, Japan wanted to try the whole Asian independence thing and strong-armed Cambodia to declare independence. That lasted for about 5 minutes because Japan lost World War II after getting fucking nuked twice. And in October, France welcomed themselves back in. But by the early 1950s, they started to lose their grip, getting their arses kicked by Viet Minh in Vietnam, and slowly losing their hold over Cambodia. And so, on November the 9th, 1953, Cambodia officially became independent. Enter Norodom Sihanouk, the great-grandson of King Norodom. We all love nepotism in here, don't we? The man, the myth, the absolute master of doing the bare fucking minimum while keeping power. Sihanouk was king, but after the whole independence thing happened, he became prime minister. But he quickly became bored of that title and made himself head of state, ruling like a god and pretending to care about his people. So just your average politician then. But also, being the hyper-nationalist that he was, he swiftly banned opposing parties, jailing them and any other critics alongside them, making sure that the only party that mattered was his own, the Sangkum, translating roughly to the People's Party. But what about his stance on foreign policy? Cold War? Sounds like a you problem. After World War II, Cambodia just kind of fucked off to their side of the Iron Curtain and played fence-sitter. He was on good terms with China, but he also wholeheartedly accepted US aid. He let Vietnamese troops hide in Cambodia while telling the United States that he was neutral in the Vietnam War. He also banned communism from politics while also being buddy-buddy with other communist governments. Basically, he was that guy that invited everyone to his house party, and even though everyone fucking hated him, they all came anyway, because there was free booze and weed. Then came the 60s with the Vietnam War still raging just next door. And in 1965, Sihanouk said fuck it and just went to the Chinese and Soviet side, refusing to kick the Viet Cong out of Cambodia, effectively turning the country into an Airbnb for guerrillas. The United States, as you can imagine, wasn't very fond of that information and answered appropriately. Cue Operation Menu, a very secretive bombing campaign carried out by the United States, being part of Nixon and Kissinger's strategy of weakening the Viet Cong in North Vietnam, but also in the Cambodian villages where the Viet Cong were hiding. The operation was named after menu items, with the bombing zones being codenamed things like breakfast, lunch, dinner, snack, supper, and dessert. Because you just can't commit war crimes on an empty stomach. Between 1969 and 1973, with over 3,800 bombing raids, around 540,000 tons of bombs were dropped on Cambodia. which was more than all of the bombs that the US dropped on Japan, including Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing over 150,000 Cambodians in the process. As the country was still being turned into a fucking car park, Sihanouk did the best that he could for his beloved Cambodia, by not being anywhere fucking near it. He left for his diplomatic world tours, which usually involved crawling up the arses of powerful leaders and sipping wine in Europe and Asia. On March the 18th, 1970, when he was in France, he got a phone call. Lon Nol, his own Prime Minister, had had enough of him. The National Assembly then voted to remove him from power, and Lon Nol declared Cambodia a republic, officially ending the monarchy. Anti-Vietnamese riots exploded, fueled by Lon Nol's calls for getting rid of the Viet Cong, and thousands of Vietnamese civilians living in Cambodia were all massacred in the process. Now, most people, after getting overthrown by their own Prime Minister no less, would take some time to reflect, maybe sit back and regroup, and figure out a way to get back into power. Not our boy Sihanouk though. All gas, no brakes, zero fucks given. He flew straight to China to meet with Mao Zedong, and he publicly called for all Cambodians to fight against Lon Nol. And this was probably the stupidest thing of all that he did, he allied himself with the Khmer Rouge, a group of communist rebels that he himself had jailed, tortured, and killed for years. But why though? Well, it's because they were his only chance of taking back Cambodia. And with this endorsement, thousands of Cambodians all went and joined the Khmer Rouge, believing that they were fighting for their beloved king. But I mean, it's totally fine for a king to trust an actual communist group. I'm sure this will not go horribly wrong. After all, communists are very, very well known for liking monarchies. Back in Cambodia, things were not that peachy. Vietnam was fucking furious about the overthrowing and also threw their full support behind the Khmer Rouge. The United States was still fucking bombing them, and in 1971, Lon Nol suffered a stroke, leaving him paralysed but not defeated. By 1975, the Vietnam War was at an end. The United States started pulling out of the country, including pulling out their support against the Khmer Rouge. And in April of 1975, Lon Nol, realising it was game over, fucked off to Hawaii to live out the rest of his life in exile, and letting the Khmer Rouge just march straight into Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. The people cheered, thinking that it was finally over. But little did they know that the people who came weren't liberators. They were fanatics. It was the fucking Khmer Rouge. So, where did the Khmer Rouge actually come from? Say hello to Saloth Sar, better known as Pol Pot. Born in 1925 into a wealthy farmer family with connections to the monarchy. Unlike his poor peasant peers, he grew up in relative privilege and studied in a Buddhist monastery before going to a French Catholic school in Phnom Penh. Life was going pretty normal for young Saloth Sar. Well, as normal as it can be for a pompous little elite. But it wasn't until 1949 that his life took a turn when he was awarded a scholarship to study radio electronics in France. He accepted the scholarship, but he found little interest in engineering. Instead, doing what most students do these days and spending most of his time introducing himself to the idea of communism. You see, communism in France was the hot new thing in the late 40s, ever since they got fucked over by the Germans. Probably because the idea of everyone being equally miserable started to sound pretty fair, especially among the university students, since they had plenty of time to do absolutely fuck all besides drink coffee and chain smoke, whilst wanking each other off on the idea of the common worker rising up whilst they themselves did absolutely nothing productive about it. except maybe adding some flag to their bio or keying a Tesla. It was there that Saloth Sar was first exposed to the idea of Marxism, and more importantly, Maoism, the bootleg Timu version of Marxism that falls apart the moment you try and implement it. He was a terrible student to begin with, because while his peers were passing exams, he managed to fail twice, and in 1953 his scholarship was revoked and he was deported back to Cambodia. But what he lacked in academic achievements, he more than made up for in ideology. He fully embraced the idea of communism and that his country was in desperate need of it. While Sihanouk was focused on keeping Cambodia out of the Cold War, other political movements started to rise in the dark. Among them, a small underground Cambodian communist movement, mostly influenced by Vietnam. Saloth joined this movement the very same year and quickly began working with the Viet Minh, spending a lot of time in the jungles and learning guerrilla warfare, whilst also establishing connections with his fellow revolutionaries. In 1960, he organised a meeting that would create the Communist Party of Kampuchea, later known as the Khmer Rouge. He didn't start off in a leadership position, but with a little bit of patience and leadership struggles, he slowly started to take control, and by 1963, he was in charge. For the next 12 years, he built the Khmer Rouge into a guerrilla powerhouse, gaining a lot of support from the peasants who had been affected by the Vietnam War. During that time, he adopted the name Pol Pot. Why Pol Pot? Well, God fucking knows. Some theorise it's an abbreviation of politique potentielle, meaning political potential, funnily enough, and some saying that it sounded like a common Khmer name, reinforcing the idea of him being a humble leader of the people even though he grew up in privilege. Either way, the name stuck. By the time he marched with his army into the capital, he was no longer a revolutionary, but the undisputed leader of the Khmer Rouge, ready to unleash some good old communism. The people welcomed him with open arms, thinking that he was their saviour. And Jesus Christ, were they fucking wrong. Holy shit, were they fucking wrong. The nightmare was only just beginning. April 17th, 1975. Within hours of taking over Phnom Penh, the soldiers, most of them being literal children with assault rifles because of course they were, started telling the residents that the Americans were about to bomb the city and that they needed to evacuate immediately. This was a complete lie. No Americans were coming. And the reason that they said that, well, Pol Pot wanted the cities emptied out and forced everyone into the countryside. No time for preparations or packing. Everyone, including the elderly, sick, pregnant women and children, were dragged out of their houses and the hospitals. And those who refused or were too sick to move were either left behind or just executed on the spot. Because communism. Francois Ponchot, a French Catholic priest and missionary to Cambodia who witnessed everything happening, later wrote, "The soldiers, cold and indifferent, moved like shadows among the crowds, shooting into the air, shouting at people to move faster. The sick were left behind to rot in their hospital beds." In just a mere 2 weeks, over 20,000 people died during the march. And when the survivors finally got to where they were supposed to be, things didn't get any better. Because what became known as Year Zero had just begun. Year Zero was not just the beginning of a new government, but more so an erasure of everything before it. You see, Pol Pot didn't see himself as a ruler, but as a god of the new world, one where history, lineage and culture had no meaning. The year had been set back to zero, hence the name Year Zero. Pol Pot basically copied a party tactic from 1984, where the government erases all history and rewrites it constantly to advance its own interests of complete control. And anyone who remembered history any differently would be shot. There would be no cities, no schools, no private property, or even currency for that matter. Nothing that would resemble anything close to a stable society. And if you disagreed with it, you would, again, just be shot. Educated people were the first on the chopping block. Professors, lawyers, doctors, people who under normal circumstances are pretty fucking handy to have, were now seen as a bad thing. Because anyone with an IQ higher than 20 would be able to see that communism is a fucking stupid idea. And communists don't like that. So all of them were rounded up and executed. Even wearing glasses was considered as you being an intellectual. One of the better-known Khmer Rouge mottos was, "To keep you is no profit. To destroy you is no loss." But that wasn't just a motto, that was policy. Loyalty, as you will be very, very shocked to hear under this communist regime, was mandatory. And the ones suspected of disloyalty, being that real or imagined, were also quickly disposed of. Owning property, hard labour. Speaking a foreign language, hard labour. Your hands feel too soft? Sounds like you need some hard labour in your life, my boy. Welcome to the rice fields, motherfucker. For the lucky ones that were spared, who were now named new people who mostly grew up in the city, well, they were all forced into the countryside to become farmers overnight. Feels like I've heard this one before, but don't worry, I'm sure it's going to work out just fine this time. And on top of that, you were expected to pay a rice tax of 3 tons of rice per hectare, which was part of Pol Pot's super Great Leap Forward plan. Even though that tax was triple of what was realistically possible for a single hectare to produce. Because Pol Pot, wanting to return the country into an agrarian society, agrarian meaning a rural farming-based way of life like many others before him, although very, very based, these people did not have the bare fucking minimum understanding of how farming even works. Again, I feel like I've heard that one before. But alas, the ones that didn't meet the rice quota were marked as lazy and executed. Or they had their entire harvest seized from them and they were just left to starve. And with starvation came that cornerstone of any communist society, famine. The farmers, after working for 16 hours straight, came back home to nothing. No food, no water. Malaria, dysentery and typhoid spread rapidly, and since all of the hospitals were closed and all of the doctors were now 6 feet under the dirt, people started to rot away. The Khmer Rouge, of course, they were eating like kings, and they were all sleeping in nice clean beds and executing anyone that had something to say about that. Pol Pot, now absolutely drunk with power, believed that enemies were everywhere. Everyone from Vietnam spies, Americans, FBI, CIA, KGB, all the fucking alphabets in the world, they were all definitely, absolutely, 100% trying to steal his rice reserves. Entire villages were actually burnt to the ground because one single person in the whole village was suspected of counter-revolutionary behaviour. Pol Pot famously said, "It is better to arrest 10 innocent people than let one enemy go free." Public executions became common. People were watching their friends and families being beaten, shot, or simply hacked to death because bullets were too expensive and farming tools like hammers, shovels, and bamboo sticks were abundant for the job. But what about all the corpses piling up? Well, the Khmer Rouge had a solution for that. Just yeet them into the fields and let Mother Nature do the rest. Yes, bodies were littered all over the countryside to be used as fertilizer. And even to this day, Cambodian farmers ploughing their fields keep uncovering human bones. This is pretty much where the term "the killing fields" comes from. Foreign goods were also banned because, remember, self-sufficiency. That meant no technology, medicine, or tools. People were legit dropping dead from the most common afflictions that you can imagine, like a mild case of UTI that could have been easily cleared up with a basic run of antibiotics. God forbid you got a paper cut because that's your whole arm gone. But where was Norodom Sihanouk during all of this? Well, he was briefly used as a puppet before Pol Pot just went, fuck it, and executed his entire family and put him under house arrest. He spent his days trapped and powerless to do anything. Not that I think he would have actually done anything about it. But while Sihanouk was locked away in his house, Pol Pot's real enforcers were hard at work. Enter the Santebao, the Khmer Rouge's very own secret police, roughly translating to Keepers of Peace. A very appropriate name, isn't it? But these guys weren't your run-of-the-mill killers. And they were very, very passionate about their job, which of course was to keep the peace. In the form of hunting, torturing, and executing in that order. Pol Pot's biggest fear was betrayal and disloyalty, and the Santebao were there to harshly punish those very things. So, in order to make themselves look loyal, people would falsely accuse everyone around them of all kinds of shit. Don't like your neighbour, just say you heard them talking some shit about Pol Pot, and gone. Wearing the wrong colour of socks today, gone. Thinking about anything else other than the rice fields, gone. It wasn't enough that you were loyal, you had to constantly prove you were loyal by accusing someone else. More accusations, more executions, less people to worry about betraying you. It was paranoia on horse steroids. The Santebao were a full-blown, government-funded sadist group, and one of their favourite ways to make you confess was the re-education system. And the crown jewel of all of that was a place where they had perfected that art. The subject of this video. Tuol Sleng S21 Prison. Located in the centre of Phnom Penh within a neighbourhood called Tuol Sleng translating roughly into Hill of the Poisonous Trees, was an unassuming compound that used to be Tuol Sve Pre High School. The Khmer Rouge, being the anti-intellectual nutters that they were, saw no value in education. But what they did see was a very convenient location with facilities that could be easily repurposed into prison cells. So they got to work. Hence the whole joke about high school from the intro. They stripped any remnants of it being a place of learning and they filled the classrooms with makeshift cells made out of cheap, poorly built brick walls with so little space that you could barely lie down in them. And they looked like they would collapse if you even farted on them. But that didn't really matter since nobody that was kept there had the strength left to do that anyway. Windows were barred and covered in barbed wire. Not just to prevent prisoners from escaping, but also to prevent prisoners from throwing themselves out of the windows to end their suffering. Then came the metal beds, the same ones that you see in horror movies. They were not made for sleeping, as you can see with the lack of mattresses and the chains on them, that paints a rather good picture of what they were used for. And of course, the courtyard, once a place used to take a break from studies, was turned into an execution yard, with the exercise equipment converted into torture devices. And finally, rules were set in place. Now you would think a prison built for the purpose of torturing and killing didn't really need any rules, but the Khmer Rouge had a rather sadistic sense of order. There were 10 simple commandments that every prisoner had to follow. Some of them included gems like, you must answer accordingly to my question, don't turn them away. There was also, while getting lashes or electrification, you must not cry at all. And my personal favourite, if you disobey any point of my regulations, you shall get either 10 lashes or electric discharge. In summary, the once school was transformed into a death factory. Every classroom, every hallway, and every office was reconstructed not for keeping prisoners, but to break them. Be that physically, mentally, or spiritually. S21 was not technically a prison, because a prison would imply that you would get to leave at some point. The point of it was to extract confessions out of you. It didn't matter if you had anything to confess or not. They weren't interested in the truth, and good golly, you were going to confess. You were going to suffer, and then you were going to die. But how did they get the confessions out of you? Well, let's go through all of them, shall we? And this part of the video is not for the faint-hearted. The beatings were daily. Not to get anything out of you, but just because, why the fuck not? Iron rods, bricks, rifle butts, whatever was nearby, they used it. Some beatings were not meant to kill you, but to cripple you. The more common techniques were shattering kneecaps so that you couldn't walk ever again and leaving you to crawl on the floor. Beating you until your bones snapped, or even just shattering your jaw so that you couldn't chew food and then leaving you in your cell to die of starvation. Electrocution was also used daily. Car batteries were attached to fingers, tongues, nipples, or genitals, or all of them all at once. And they were turned on just long enough for you to foam at the mouth, but not long enough for you to die. Moving on to the water torture, the ever so popular waterboarding. But the worst method was known as filth immersion, where the prisoner's head was forced into a barrel that contained blood, piss, and shit. They would hold your head under that until the very last moment, yank you up to let you gasp for air, and then do it all over again. As you can see, things are only getting worse and worse, but trust me, this is only the beginning, you'll be glad to hear, because next up was forced self-mutilation. Guards would force prisoners to rip out their own nails, most of the time with their own teeth. And other times they were given a dull knife to cut their own fingers off one by one. If they refused, they would get beaten. If they did it, well, they would still get beaten. One survivor commented later, "I saw a man cut off his own pinky with a rusty knife. He passed out from the pain. When he woke up, they told him to do the next one." There was also hanging, but not the kind intended for killing. Prisoners were hung upside down and dumped into water, sometimes even combining the aforementioned filth immersion. And when they stopped twitching, they would pull you back up to let you gasp for air, and then do it all over again. Others were strangled very slowly, the rope tightened around their necks inch by inch until they passed out. One prisoner actually described guards turning that into a gambling game and taking bets on who would take the longest to pass out. Next was flaying. Oh, how much fun, where they would peel off a part of your skin and then pour salt or alcohol onto it. Some people were skinned alive and left to bleed out in the sun. Some prisoners were locked into a dark room with a bunch of starving rats, letting the little rodents have a bit of a buffet. Other times, they took notes from Persian torture methods, and you would be tied up and covered in honey for swarms of ants to slowly feast on you for hours, or until the guards had heard that you had stopped screaming. And for the sake of speeding up this whole thing and to actually try and get this video monetized, I'm just going to speedrun all of the magical and wonderful ways that people died in this hellhole. Beheading, stoning, crucifixion, impalement, stabbing, poisoning, throat-slitting, bludgeoning, crushing, disembowelment, firing squad, and many, many more. But the worst one was yet to come. Now, this next part of the video is extremely bad. It's fucking bad. It's really, really fucking bad, boys. And it involves babies. So, if that's really not for you, then skip to this timestamp. Choeung Ek was one of the most infamous killing fields in Cambodia, located about 10 miles from the capital, and there at the centre of it is what is now known as the Killing Tree. At first, it seemed an unremarkable, sturdy old tree in the middle of a mass gravesite. But what made it infamous was not its appearance, but what it was used for. You see, as we already mentioned, bullets were too expensive to be used on men and women, let alone on infants. Why waste a bullet when you had a perfectly good tree sitting right there? So the soldiers came up with a much better solution. They would grab the babies by the legs and then swing them full force at the tree, killing most of them on impact. And to make it even more fucked up than it already was, mothers were made to watch. Can you imagine that? Can you fucking imagine that shit? Carrying a life for 9 months, feeding them and loving them just for some emotionless communist fucking loser soldier to turn it into absolutely nothing, while all the other soldiers made you watch. And after that, you were executed too and then thrown into the same pit as your child, while the soldiers were all making jokes about not having to dig 2 graves. To Sling S21 prison operated for almost 4 long years, from April 1975 to January of 1979. An estimated 17,000 to 20,000 men, women and children were brought there, tortured, executed and then buried in a mass grave. Out of the 20,000, there were only 12 known survivors, 7 adults and 5 children who were kept alive, most likely for possessing a skill that the guards deemed useful. That means that prison had a death rate of approximately 99.94%, one of the highest ever recorded in human history. But every nightmare, thankfully, comes to an end. When the Khmer Rouge took over in 1975, Vietnam initially supported them in that effort, since both sides were firm believers in communism. And Vietnam had just won the war against the United States, finally uniting both countries under a single-party rule. Cambodia, under Pol Pot's rule, was technically an ally, at least on paper, since he was a hardcore Maoist while Vietnam was leaning towards Marxism, and this was enough to create problems, and Pol Pot saw this as a potential future threat. And that feeling was mutual because Vietnam saw Pol Pot as dangerous and unpredictable. Over time, paranoia consumed Pol Pot's already communist brain rot mind. He started to wholeheartedly believe that Vietnam was out to get him and in response cranked up the nationalist rhetoric, portraying Vietnam as the enemy of the Khmer people. His propaganda painted Vietnam as an imperialist force that was no different from the French or the Americans, and started broadcasting constant warnings of the Vietnamese plot to, quote, swallow Cambodia whole. Bit gay, but he truly believed that Vietnam was going to strike first. Seeing as shit-talking wasn't enough, by 1977, Pol Pot started to actively provoke them. The Khmer Rouge began launching attacks along the borders, raiding villages, taking over territories, and slaughtering thousands of Vietnamese civilians, often with the same brutal methods that they used in S21. Survivors reported soldiers decapitating villagers, burning them alive, and even impaling children on bamboo sticks. One of the most morbid incidents occurred in April of 1978, when they stormed the Vietnamese town of Ba Shuc. Over 3,000 civilians were massacred in just a few days, and the town was left in ruins. As you can imagine, the Vietnamese government was rightfully fucking furious about this. The Vietnamese government actually tried to negotiate with the Khmer Rouge, but Pol Pot was having none of it, and he actually saw Vietnam's attempts at diplomacy as a sign of weakness. In his mind, he was invincible and he could push as hard as he wanted without any consequences. He even ordered the maps to be redrawn, claiming large chunks of Vietnam as part of Cambodia. But by late 1978, Vietnam had had enough. They tolerated years of this bullshit, but the massacre at Ba Shuc was the final straw. Cambodia had to be dealt with, and the Khmer Rouge had to go. On December 25th, 1978, Vietnam launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia, sending in over 150,000 troops, supported by tanks and artillery. The Khmer Rouge, despite their fanatical beliefs, were absolutely fucking shat on by the Vietnamese battle-hardened army. Within 2 weeks, they had broken through their defences, capturing towns and pushing towards Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge army, poorly trained, unorganised, and probably still tired from chucking babies at a fucking tree, crumbled under the assault. By January 7th, 1979, Vietnamese troops rolled into Phnom Penh, and the Khmer Rouge's reign of terror was finally coming to an end. They found the city eerily empty, with most of the population being forced into the countryside years earlier. The few people who were left in the city were mostly prisoners and Khmer Rouge officials who didn't manage to flee in time. As they moved through the abandoned streets, they stumbled upon S21 prison and they went inside. And what they found was far beyond their worst nightmares. The stench of death was all-consuming. Bloodstains covered almost all of the floors and the walls, some smeared into patterns as if victims had tried to claw their way out of the cells. In the final days of the Khmer Rouge, they frantically started to execute the few remaining prisoners. Bodies were left chained to metal bed frames, some being disemboweled, and others having their throats open. Many bore signs of agony so brutal that it defied any comprehension. Photographs were scattered all across the rooms, and they were mugshots of thousands of people, each taken before their inevitable execution. The black and white mugshots showed men, women, and children, some with expressions of fear and others still too young to fully understand what was about to happen to them. Bui Tin, a former Vietnamese army colonel and journalist, later recalled, "We did not prepare for what we saw. The horror was indescribable. I walked into a room and there was a body still chained to a bed, bloated and rotting. The walls were covered in dark stains. This was not a prison. This was a slaughterhouse." Amidst the horror, the soldiers found the few aforementioned survivors. One of them was Bao Meng, an artist whose skill in painting had actually spared him from execution. And people say being an artist is useless. But anyway, he later testified, "I was forced to paint portraits of Pol Pot. That was the only reason I lived. My wife was taken away, and I never saw her again." Another survivor, Choeung Ek, recounted his ordeal. "They broke my fingers, they electrocuted me, they beat me until I could barely breathe. They wanted me to confess to things I had never done. They killed my wife, they killed my baby. I am only alive because I could fix their typewriters." Realizing that they had uncovered one of the worst atrocities in human history, they started collecting as much evidence as possible, photographing the corpses, documenting the torture devices, and collecting testimonies from the few survivors. But the scale of the Khmer Rouge's brutality was still being uncovered. Tuol Sleng was just a small piece of the full nightmare. Across Cambodia, mass graves were being discovered, including the infamous killing fields, where millions of people were brutally murdered and stuffed into a hole in the ground. Meanwhile, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge fled west towards the Thai border, taking refuge in the jungle. The Khmer Rouge soldiers, after the Vietnamese soldiers saw what they had just fucking done, were all promptly executed on the spot, or they were captured and then put on trial by the new Cambodian government, which was now backed by Vietnam. Pol Pot, however, managed to evade capture for nearly 2 decades. Despite being responsible for one of the worst genocides in human history, he remained free and leading what was left of the Khmer Rouge, alongside the Thai-Cambodia border. For years, he received support from China because of fucking course. And he was even still getting supported by some Western nations who were still pissy about getting their teeth kicked in by Vietnam. They continued to fight as guerrillas, but their influence was dwindling over time. By the late 1990s, Pol Pot's own movement started to turn against him. In 1997, he was arrested and put under house arrest by his former comrades. And in April of 1998, a year later, he allegedly died from a heart attack in his sleep. Though some people suspect that he was actually murdered or he poisoned himself to prevent being captured and facing punishment for his crimes. As for the other Khmer Rouge soldiers, many somehow blended back into society, never facing any justice for what they had done. Some were captured and imprisoned, while others simply walked free and took on new identities. Only a handful of high-ranking officials were ever prosecuted. In 2006, the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia was established, which was a special tribunal that put the surviving Khmer Rouge leaders on trial. Some examples being Choeung Ek, better known as Comrade Dutch, who was the overseer of S21 prison. He was captured in 1999 and finally put on trial in 2009, more than 3 decades later after everything that he did. And in 2010, he was sentenced to life in prison for crimes against humanity. And Khieu Samphan, Pol Pot's second in command, got the same sentence 10 years later in 2018. Turns out it doesn't matter where they are in the world, courts take fucking ages to do anything. But anyway, despite the trials, true justice was never fully served for the millions that had suffered. Many Cambodians had to live alongside former Khmer Rouge members who escaped punishment. The scars left by the genocide, both physical and psychological, still linger in Cambodia to this day. While Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia did bring an end to the genocide, out of necessity, not altruism mind you, many Cambodians saw Vietnam as just another occupying force rather than a liberator. Resistance groups, including remnants of the Khmer Rouge, continued to fight against Vietnam until they withdrew in 1989, because they had their own problems with their main backer, the Soviet Union, collapsing. So they could no longer afford to maintain their military presence in Cambodia. As they pulled out, the Cambodian government, now led by Hun Sen, who had been installed by Vietnam, was left to pick up the bloody and broken pieces. In 1991, the Paris Peace Agreements were signed, paving the way for the arrival of the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia in 1992. And it was one of the largest peacekeeping missions in UN history. They were aiming to disarm the still warring factions, oversee elections, and rebuild what was left of the economy. In 1993, Cambodia held its first democratic election, which resulted in a sharing government between Norodom Ranariddh, who was the son of Sihanouk, and Hun Sen. However, Hun Sen was not the best at sharing power, and in 1997 he launched a coup. Because of course he did. He overthrew Ranariddh, but I hate these bloody Cambodian names, Ranariddh, and consolidated his rule, which continues to this day. Over the years, the genocide inspired many movies and documentaries, none of which I want to watch because writing the script for this topic was soul-crushing enough. But some of the more notable ones include 1984's The Killing Fields. The movie is based on the true story of Dith Pran, a Cambodian journalist and interpreter who worked with American journalist Sidney Schanberg during the Khmer Rouge takeover. Another one includes S21, the Khmer Rouge's Killing Machine, which was made in 2003. And it's a documentary by Cambodian filmmaker Rithi Pan that focuses specifically on S21 prison, with interviews from both former survivors and even former guards. But if you don't like man-made horrors beyond your comprehension in movie form, may I introduce you to the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum. The prison may have ceased to be in 1979, but it didn't take long for it to become a grim reminder of the past. By 1980, only a year after it was discovered, Tuol Sleng was officially converted into a museum. Its purpose now is documenting the atrocities that occurred within the walls. Unlike other sites of genocide that have been rebuilt and sanitised, Tuol Sleng remains preserved in its original state. It's left exactly the way it was when the Khmer Rouge abandoned it. Walking into the museum today, you are not greeted by flashy signs and a souvenir shop. There is no dramatisation of what happened there. There is none of the touristy shit. It's just quiet. Eerily quiet. The moment you step in, you can feel it. The air is heavy, the walls are suffocating and still soaked in the suffering that they witnessed. So you can just go there and stand in the very same rooms where some of the greatest crimes against humanity happened. Fun for the whole family. It's divided into several blocks, each showcasing a different aspect of the horror that took place there. The classrooms that were turned into cells remain unchanged. Shackles still bolted to the floors, and some cells contain bed frames where prisoners were tortured, with photographs hanging on the walls showing the last moments of the ones that were found there, mutilated and left to rot. Another section is filled with thousands of photographs of victims. Men, women, children, and even infants who were not spared. Some look absolutely terrified, others already accepting their fate, just happy to be free of the daily torture. The torture devices are also on display. How wonderful! One of the most harrowing parts inside the prison is the confession room, where you can actually read the forced confessions extracted from prisoners after days or sometimes even weeks of endless torture. In a room close to it, visitors can see the actual preserved skulls and bones of the prisoners displayed in glass cases. Some of the skulls bear visible fractures, which are marks of the brutal executions carried out, all in the name of saving bullets. But perhaps the most haunting sight of all, in my opinion, is the group of actual survivors who sometimes stand outside of the prison selling books about their experiences and answering visitors' questions and telling them all their stories, ensuring that what happened there never gets forgotten. And if all of that still isn't enough for you, beyond the walls of Tuol Sleng at Choeung Ek, you can visit the Killing Tree. Today, still standing, but no longer just a tree. It's wrapped in colourful bracelets and ribbons left by visitors as an offering of remembrance. A sign stands beside it, explaining what happened there. And nearby, a memorial with a glass case filled with thousands of human skulls found in the fields. The resting place of those who were executed at Choeung Ek. The first time I learned about S21 was when I was watching a documentary about the museum some time ago, and it just stuck with me for some reason. The guy making the documentary, after going through the museum and coming to the tree at the very end and learning about what happened at that spot, he simply just stares at it in silence. The tree surrounded by the mass graves. Then the weight of history just started pressing down on him and he started crying, unable to comprehend how such a horror could have taken place there. You know, it's really fucking hard to wrap up a topic like this one. There really is just no satisfying end to a story of this magnitude. The Khmer Rouge turned Cambodia into a living nightmare. And after being disbanded, most of them just lived free without consequences, and they just completely fucking got away with it. Pol Pot's vision of an agrarian utopia resulted in one of the worst genocides in history, with over 2 million people dead. That was actually 25% of Cambodia's population at the time. The only good thing that I could drag out of everything is that Cambodia still stands. Phnom Penh is alive, bustling and growing, and the Cambodian people have rebuilt their country from the ashes, carrying their history with them but refusing to forget and be defined by it. The Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum is a permanent reminder of the past. It exists not just as a memorial, but as a warning. This happened, this was real, and it should never happen again. It serves as a very important warning about creating positions of absolute power. Because one day, that position could be occupied by a fucking psychopath.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube! Everybody subscribe!